Hello and welcome to Podcast Essentials. Today we're talking about storytelling. And again, I'm joined by my co-host from sunny Blaney, New South Wales, Rich Bowden. How are you, Rich?
Good, thank you, John. Tropical Blaney in New South Wales, if you don't mind. It's been a scorcher. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad. Got up to double figures today, did we?
Oh, double figures. What's that?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't too bad today. It has been a bit of a cold snap at the moment. Frost is on the ground, etc. How's your drought?
We're expecting rain. We've had a bit of a drizzle, so yeah. All right,
Good.
we might hook into it. Today we're talking about storytelling and the gentle art thereof. The thing with storytelling is that it's basically a marker of humanity, I believe. If we imagine a situation where back in the Pleistocene where we were hunter-gatherers and a band of us, and we split into little groups to go looking for food, come back, sit around the fire and eat, we started telling each other stories. We didn't just sit there quietly in silence eating and then retire to our beds. So you'd have some people saying things like, oh, I don't know, saw gazelle tracks down by the river the other hour. Someone else saying the berries are looking early this year, and someone else saying, oh, look, the birds have left the nests. It might be an early winter.
Mm.
And these sort of little bits of information change how people saw their world. So they went from one state of understanding to another based on the new information. When you start piling these things together, you end up with things like, what are we talking about? The sagas, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the story of Beowulf. These are all much later, obviously, than the Pleistocene, but they're based on that whole idea of teaching people through storytelling. Most of those, of course, are based on the idea of the hero's journey, which I think is a good tool to use, particularly in even any sort of podcast, really. So say you're running a sales podcast, you can say, here's the problem. Our hero takes off, faces lack of sales, discovers its new system, goes through a change, and now their life is better. That sort of thing. I think that, and even with World Organic News, even though I'm picking stuff from 50 to 100 different blog posts, it normally narrows down to about 3 or 4 that I can put a narrative around and have a story so that we can see a change through time. You got any thoughts on that, Rich?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, John. Also, in your part of the world now, in Ireland, this was a major thing, wasn't it? Because the isolated villages were cut off from news sources, so they were travelling minstrels that also told stories. That was the news, and they brought the news from the cities and from the places further out. And it was such an important part of Irish life that it became, with the music, embedded in the culture, and that's never gone away.
Yeah. Well, the early stories, of course, were poems, because it's easier to remember poetry. It works on a different part of the brain. I'm not suggesting people produce podcasts in iambic pentameter, but gee, I'd love to hear one.
I wouldn't mind either.
Well, there's a task for you, Rich.
Give me an idea.
Oh, God help us. We'll all be ruined, as they say.
Thanks for your support there, John.
No, that's okay. Yeah, no, fully behind you on this one.
This is your crazy idea for once, not mine.
The point is, though, that the storytelling and even the profession of storyteller was a hangover from our hunter-gatherer days. There was a rememberer in each tribe that we believe, from the anthropology that we can work out, someone who remembered the stories, so that when weather patterns changed over a lifetime, there'd be stories from this fella's grandparents' age. So, oh no, we got some of that. This is what happened then, and this is what they did to survive. And so I think the idea of storytelling as part of humanity is so deeply ingrained in us that if we're not using it in podcasts, we're both letting ourselves down and our listeners. And I think even if you're not formally doing it, if people look at their podcasts, they'll see that they do actually form stories. But if we go about it in a more formal manner, then we can actually craft it so that we lead people from a beginning through to an end. And we can explain the end at the beginning if we want, and then the steps to get there. Filmmakers know about this sort of thing. And there's a link in the notes. Let me rephrase that. There's a link in the podcast, the blog accompanying the podcast over at mrjohnmoore.com. If you click on the little tab at the top there that says blog, there's a short piece there. And there's a link at the bottom of it to the 12 steps in the hero's journey. And that comes from a filmmaker's blog site. They have to tell stories quickly, like an hour and a half, not the several days you can get into a novel. But the same process applies. And even if you're doing a 10-minute podcast, you can still take people on a journey, which I think is important because people will then remember what you're telling them for a start, or what you're attempting to impart, but they'll also remember you as a storyteller. And we all know someone at parties that can tell good stories, and people gather around them. I think it's a skill that we've got it innately almost. There's been a selective pressure for it. The CBC show we were talking about the other day, Ideas, they did a whole couple of episodes on it.
Yeah.
And the point they made was, imagine those hunter-gatherers again that came home, ate their meal in silence, and then went to bed. And if one of the stories was, I saw a crocodile the other day, but no one else knew about it, you'd be losing people to the crocodiles.
Yes.
So those early ancestors of ours that could actually hold a conversation and tell stories are why we're here. So I think there's something fascinating about a good story as well. You look at the Lord of the Rings or Lord of the Flies, either of those, they work out slightly different endings, but it's the same sort of thing. There's a hero, a protagonist, and an antagonist, and the protagonist goes through some sort of trial through the process. Now, they don't always have to be like this, but the more interesting stories are when the hero has to come up against an obstacle. I think they work best, particularly in audio form, because people can imagine the scenes themselves without having the pictures put in front of them. And it's our imaginations that matter. And that's the difference between podcasting and, say, video making or even book writing. Any thoughts, Rich?
Look, John, just as you were talking there, I was just going to have a quick shout out to a podcast that John and I listened to called How Sound, and it examines radio storytelling. It's quite wonderful because it selects old podcasts or radio programs, and not only does it replay them, so you get to hear them again. I listened to one on Jim Jones' tragedy again, and it was so powerful. But they also explain what's going on and what the producers are doing and how they're telling the story. Now, that as a podcaster for me was a real eye opener. There's one, John, if you don't mind me just rattling on just a little bit, but there was one where they talk about an E, and they actually start off. They call it an E because they start off at the end and then work their way back, and it comes back to an E. And that's a storytelling structure that fascinates me, and something that I'll put in one of my crazy ideas compartments, John, and I'll tell that one. Perhaps in poetry form.
Yes.
Yeah, why not?
Or blank verse at the very least.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry, go for your life.
I was just going to give it. It's transom.org is the website. So just a quick shout out for them.
I'll put that in the show notes to the podcast that comes from this.
And
the point you were making there about telling you what's going on, they're telling you what's going on from the podcast producers or the radio producers' point of view, and their technical steps. And that they also do a couple of good things on soundscaping that we talked about last week.
Yes.
But yeah, it's. I think we just need to focus on how to tell a story, and there's so many blog posts out there that it's not hard to find. I think someone come up with there's only 7 stories ever told, and everything's a variation on that. But it's the hero's journey that seems to grip most people, and if you can if you can ease your listener into actually caring about the hero, whether it's them or someone else, then you've got them. And it's that authenticity again that comes through with podcasting, and the intimacy, because you can be in the story as it's being told, and it's wonderful. And it's not just for creative writing podcasts or poetry podcasts. It's actually a universal tool, I think, that fits right across the species. I can't think of a culture that doesn't tell stories. Everyone has their own foundation myths, which is a variation on those other stories I was talking about earlier. And there's a certain similarity to creation myths. There was a land with no people. People were created in some way. People belong to the land, or the land belongs to the people, depending on which culture that the story's coming from. But there's always a trial and a test to actually get to the point where the culture is established. Think of the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh that was then borrowed by the Bible and those sorts of things. It doesn't seem to be a universal thing, the flood, but the struggle and something to overcome is quite universal. And we become better people for going through our trials, I think, is the message behind most of them. If we think of, is it Gawain in the, what am I thinking of? The Holy Grail series, where he stumbles into the Fisher King. He stumbles into the Fisher King's castle, but doesn't ask the question, how can I help? And then has to go on a whole series of adventures to get back to the castle, which is in some way magical and disappears and reappears and things. But then he goes back to the point where he started. How can I help? But by the time he gets there, he's a different person because of all the adventures he's been through. It's a structure we can all use, I think, without too much trouble. Did you think that fits in with the podcasts you're doing, Rich?
Yeah, it's the journey, isn't it, John? And you just pointed out it. Once you do go on, we take our listeners on that journey. They are better informed, or they're better people even. They've taken their time. They've listened for half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour more. And that time is an investment in them, in their character or their knowledge. So it is a journey. There's just one point that I just note when you said at the start, what you were talking about, sympathy for character being so important. There's a screenwriting term called Save the Cat. And it was an old screenwriting term, and it was that the hero at the start always saves something or someone, and it was like a cat, just use the cat, save the cat. The book I read on that was quite interesting, and the guy said it's not done much anymore in films. But in the old days, there was always something that the hero did to start off, and people go, and they sort of think, oh, this guy's good. And that sort of started the whole thing off. I just thought I'd throw that in, John.
No, that makes sense, because then you're building empathy with the character.
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
I'm just trying to think how we would apply that to podcasts. So it's, say you're doing a sales podcast, someone saves someone else's business, maybe. I don't know. But certainly with the World Organic News, we have people that are coming up with solutions to climate change and soil loss and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
so you can see that they're actually changing the world for the better at the beginning. Although we don't always get to have all the positive stories we'd like, but sometimes you need to have the negative to show off the positive as well. And that you go all Pollyanna-ish for the whole show, no one's going to learn anything, because there isn't that one sympathy for the hero and then the connection with the story. So it's an idea that needs developing, I think, in most of us. Those that are from a, what's the word I'm after, documentary background or filmmaking background, this sort of thing is innate. But for the rest of us, we have to pick it up and learn as we go. You're about to say something, Rich?
Just to say that interconnectedness, I can hardly say it, John. It's been a bit a long day. Interconnectedness between, I think you mentioned earlier, that's so important, isn't it? Like we don't exist as islands, as people. And when we listen to podcasts, we are choosing to listen, to communicate, to learn, and it's that interconnectedness that I think is part of the story, and integral part of the story as well.
Yeah, it's our humanity. It connects us with other people around the world. I think that really great audio documentaries take us to places we would not normally go.
Yeah.
And help us feel how other people would feel, or at least empathize with them. We can't always, feel exactly how they did because of the culture and the time they grew up in and whatnot. But it is so innately part of us as humans that I think we're doing it anyway. We just need to formalize it when we're organizing our scripts or our bullet points, or however we particularly do our podcasts. And I know with our conversational ones, we don't always know where we're going, but something will turn up and there'll be a point of contention perhaps, or suddenly it'll all resolve and go, oh, that makes more sense. Yeah. And if we can take our listeners with us, that's half the fun.
Yeah. So, John, for people listening that are just either considering or they've just started out their podcast, just the point you made there about scripting, semi-scripting, or not scripting at all, what would you say to them? Would you advise them to script until they're confident enough to just to talk it through, or not? How would you go? Within the context of the story that they're trying to tell.
Well, it depends again on what sort of podcast they're doing. If it's two people getting together and rambling, perhaps having some key points about where they're going and what they're trying to say. But quite often, if it's a history show or something like that, then I think having it fully scripted helps because you're not going to miss anything, and you've got the narrative there. I always script mine apart from these ones, obviously, because they're a bit more free-flowing and free-form. But normally I'll script because there's information that's key and there's references I have to make and quotes and things. There are other people I know that do similar sorts of shows, but they just have bullet points and then they talk around each bullet point. For beginners, I think fully scripting has benefits in that all the information's there. But the drawback is it can sound like you're just reading a script into a microphone. And that's understandable because the first 5 to 20, you're worried about the tech more than the story. But it is relatively easy to get nuance into your voice when you're reading. It just takes practice. And people will tell you if you're sounding monotone or a bit dry, unless that's the tone you're going for. So yeah, I would recommend more fully scripted, if not completely scripted, at least bullet points with perhaps longish paragraphs attached. So you've got some anchor point to come back to, so that if you go off on a tangent, you've then got your way stations along the way to come back to. And yourself, Rich?
Yeah, no, good points there, John. I'm just thinking too, the story factor that you're saying can be applied to pretty much anything, can it? You were saying before about a sales podcast, how the hero story would relate to that. It's perhaps more about solving a problem, but it's still with the hero being the product, perhaps, and still solving the problem. The problem is X, and how using the sales podcast will tell the story of how to be better off with the product that would be. So yeah, no, that was very interesting what you were saying, John, about especially about the history. I love that bit about that is what makes us human. I don't know, it resonates a bit. I'll have to quote you on that one.
Contemplate it anyway. Yeah. Well, so I did my degree in archaeology, so I'm always looking backwards before I look forwards. But I do think that it's one of the key things about being human: tool making, storytelling, and cooking food.
Mm.
And in some way, those three are all related, because once you're starting to cook food, everyone sits around together, and then you've got the opportunity for storytelling. Of course, you've got to toss language in. It's very difficult to tell stories without a language.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't really matter what medium we're using. Although, as Marshall McLuhan would say, the medium is the message.
Yeah.
I think the point there is that the medium modifies how we tell our story. You know, the old wandering storyteller reciting his version of the trials of Cuchulainn up in the Ulster Ring is going to be completely different from someone giving an audio file across the internet, and people will hear it differently. Although on that point, I think the audio file is closer to the storyteller than any of the other media are about. You know, the novel we have to hold and read, and video we have to watch. But with the audio versions, podcasting, we can actually hear it as we're doing other things and pay attention with that part of our mind. In fact, I'm almost tempted to do one in iambic pentameter now, just to see if it feels any different. This may be more trouble than it's worth, Rich, but we'll give it a crack.
Why not? We're still young.
Young at heart, anyway. Yeah. So, as you can see, I'm out in the outside studio, but unfortunately, my battery has just turned to red, so I might actually pull it up at that. There's free checklists available over at mrjohnmoore.com for the pre-launch part of podcasting. And again, as we said earlier, there's the blog tab will get you to an accompanying article on this particular presentation. And a big thank you to those that have signed up for the free checklist in the last week. I'm quite surprised to see it, and it's quite gratifying to hear people are listening. Next episode, next episode will be on the one we're all waiting for, copyright.
Yeah.
And what you can and can't do, and why you should and shouldn't do it. But that should be fun. So on that happy note, we might pull this to an end before my battery completely disappears, and we end with a strange, abrupt ending. Alrighty, well, we'll see you on Friday.
Thanks, John. That was great.